I want to go to Paula Reed. She's been reading through the opinion. Paula, what are you gleaning from it?
All right, Pamela, here's what we know. This is a big win for President Trump because he has been railing against the so-called nationwide injunctions. This is the power of a single judge to block an executive order for the entire country.
President Trump is escalating his fight with the courts and calling for Judge James Boasberg to be impeached. In a new interview, he denies that his administration defied the judge's orders to stop the deportation of hundreds of alleged Venezuelan gang members.
I never did defy a court order.
And you wouldn't in the future?
No, you can't do that. However, we have bad judges. We have very bad judges, and these are judges that shouldn't be allowed.
The Trump administration says the flights had already left U.S. airspace when the judge's ruling came down, and now Republicans in Congress say they plan to introduce articles of impeachment against Judge Boasberg and 4 other judges who recently ruled against President Trump's executive orders.
Okay, so what just happened is absolutely explosive, and it represents one of the most serious constitutional crises we've seen in modern American history. President Trump just publicly attacked a federal judge who ruled against him, not just criticized the ruling, not just disagreed with the legal reasoning, actually attacked the judge personally, called him crooked, called him biased, said he's weaponizing the judiciary. And then, and this is where it gets truly unprecedented, Trump called for the judge's impeachment and even suggested the judge should be arrested, a sitting president calling for the arrest of a federal judge who ruled against him. Let that sink in for a second. And the response from Capitol Hill has been immediate and dramatic. House Democrats, with support from some Republicans, have filed new articles of impeachment against Trump. They're saying this isn't just inappropriate, this isn't just norm-breaking, this is an abuse of power. This is an attempt to intimidate the judiciary. This is a fundamental attack on the separation of powers, and it cannot go unanswered. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
And this case came up as a result of multiple challenges to his effort to limit birthright citizenship through an executive order. Now, here it appears that the justices are agreeing with Trump and limiting this power that judges have to block a policy for the entire country. Now, on another issue, it does not appear that they have weighed in on whether Trump's effort to limit birthright citizenship is or is not constitutional. Instead, they are limiting the power of these judges to block policies for the entire country, which will likely allow Trump to proceed with this effort to limit birthright citizenship while the larger constitutional questions about whether he can do that are being litigated.
And then there's Trump's other very, I guess, personal attorney, Alina Habba. Trump appointed her to be the interim U.S. attorney for New Jersey, despite a complete lack of qualifications for the job and a history of saying things like this.
That prompted a rare statement from Supreme Court Chief John Roberts, who warned, quote, for more than 2 centuries, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreements concerning judicial decisions.
So let me give you the context here, because you need to understand how we got to this point. Judge James Boasberg issued rulings against Trump's administration, specific rulings about specific policies, the kind of thing that happens all the time in our system. The executive branch does something, someone challenges it in court, a judge reviews the law and the facts and makes a ruling. Sometimes the government wins, sometimes they lose. That's how checks and balances work. That's how the judiciary serves as a check on executive power. And when the government loses, they can appeal. They can try to get a higher court to overturn the decision. They can modify their policy to address the court's concerns. What they can't do, what they're absolutely not supposed to do, is attack the judge personally and call for their removal or arrest. But that's exactly what Trump did. After Judge Boasberg's rulings, Trump went on social media, went to rallies, gave interviews, and in all of these venues, he personally attacked Judge Boasberg, called him corrupt, suggested he was acting out of political bias rather than legal judgment, said the judge was part of a conspiracy to undermine Trump's presidency, and then Trump escalated, started calling for Boasberg's impeachment, started suggesting that judges who rule against the president should be removed from the bench. And in some of his more inflammatory moments, Trump even suggested that judges like Boasberg should be arrested. For what crime? For making rulings. Trump doesn't like. That's it. That's the offense. A judge did his job, applied the law, and reached a conclusion Trump disagreed with. And Trump's response is to call for the judge's impeachment and arrest. Now, this isn't the first time Trump has attacked judges. He's got a long history of this, going back to the campaign, going back to his first term. Whenever a judge rules against him, Trump attacks. He called a judge hearing a case about Trump University a Mexican who couldn't be impartial because of Trump's immigration policies. Even though the judge was born in Indiana, he's attacked judges as so-called judges whose rulings don't count. He's called judges radical leftists, Obama judges, partisan hacks, all for doing their jobs, all for ruling based on law rather than political loyalty. But this latest attack on Judge Boasberg is different, more extreme, more dangerous. Because Trump isn't just insulting the judge, he's calling for the judge's removal and imprisonment. That's not criticism, that's intimidation. That's an attempt to make judges afraid to rule against the president. And Congress is responding. House Democrats moved quickly, filed formal articles of impeachment. The charges focus on Trump's attempts to intimidate the judiciary, his abuse of executive power, and his systematic efforts to undermine the separation of powers. They're arguing that a president who attacks judges for ruling against him, who calls for their impeachment and arrest, is fundamentally unfit for office, is violating his oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, is creating a constitutional crisis that threatens the independence of the judiciary. And some Republicans are joining them, not a lot, but enough to signal that this crosses a line even for Trump's defenders. Because judicial independence isn't a partisan issue, it's fundamental to how our system works. And when a president attacks it this directly, this aggressively, it threatens everyone. Republican judges, Democratic judges, everyone. Chief Justice John Roberts has issued a rare public rebuke. Roberts almost never comments on political controversies, almost never speaks publicly about criticism of the judiciary. But Trump's attacks were so extreme, so dangerous, that Roberts felt he had to respond, and his statement was direct and forceful. Impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement over a judicial decision. Judges make rulings based on law, not politics. Attacking judges for doing their jobs undermines the rule of law and threatens judicial independence. Those aren't the exact words, but that's the message. And it's significant coming from Roberts, because he's the Chief Justice, he's the head of the judicial branch, and he's saying publicly that what Trump is doing is wrong, is dangerous, is a threat to the Constitution. Legal scholars across the political spectrum are sounding alarms. They're calling this a constitutional crisis in real time. They're warning that if Trump's attacks on judges go unchecked, it sets a precedent that future presidents can follow. That any president who doesn't like a ruling can attack the judge who issued it, can call for their removal, can intimidate them into ruling favorably. And if that becomes normalized, if that becomes acceptable presidential behavior, the judiciary stops functioning as an independent branch, becomes just another tool of executive power. Judges start ruling based on what the president wants rather than what the law requires. And that's the end of the rule of law. That's how democracies die. When courts can't check executive power because judges are afraid of retaliation, that's authoritarianism. And legal experts are warning that Trump's behavior is pushing us in that direction. Is testing whether our institutions are strong enough to resist. And the answer to that test is going to be determined by how Congress responds, by whether impeachment moves forward, by whether there are real consequences for Trump's attacks on the judiciary. All right, so let's dig into the specifics here, because there are multiple layers to this crisis and you need to understand each one. We need to talk about what Judge Boasberg actually ruled, why Trump reacted so aggressively, what Trump's specific attacks were, how Congress is responding with impeachment articles, what Chief Justice Roberts said, and what this means for the separation of powers and judicial independence, because all of these pieces connect. And together they show why this moment is so dangerous, why legal experts are calling it a constitutional crisis, why this isn't just normal political conflict, but something that threatens the fundamental structure of our government. So first, let's talk about Judge Boasberg's rulings. James Boasberg is a federal district judge in Washington, D.C. He was appointed by President Obama in 2011. He served on the bench for years. Has a reputation as a careful, thoughtful jurist. Not particularly ideological, just someone who tries to apply the law fairly. And in November 2025, he issued rulings in cases challenging Trump administration policies. The specific policies vary. some related to immigration enforcement, some to regulatory actions, some to executive orders. The details matter less than the pattern. In multiple cases, Judge Boasberg found that Trump administration actions violated the law, that they exceeded executive authority, that they didn't follow proper administrative procedures, that they were arbitrary and capricious. All standard administrative law findings, the kind that judges issue against government actions all the time, regardless of which party controls the White House. When judges find government actions unlawful, they can issue various remedies. They can block the action from being enforced, can require the government to go back and follow proper procedures, can declare the action void. Judge Boasberg did all of these things in his rulings, and that meant Trump administration policies were halted or reversed. That's obviously frustrating for any administration. No president likes having their policies blocked by courts. But it's part of the system, part of how checks and balances work. The normal response is to appeal, to try to get a higher court to overturn the ruling, to modify the policy to address the court's concerns and try again. What's not normal, what's completely inappropriate, is to personally attack the judge and call for their removal. But that's what Trump did. Within hours of Judge Boasberg's rulings becoming public, Trump was posting on social media, on Truth Social, on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. And his posts were aggressive and personal. He called Judge Boasberg crooked, said the judge was biased against Trump, suggested the rulings were politically motivated rather than based on law. All of this crosses lines that presidents aren't supposed to cross. Presidents can disagree with rulings, can say they think a court got the law wrong, can announce they're appealing, but they're not supposed to attack judges personally, not supposed to question their integrity, not supposed to suggest judges are corrupt just because they rule against the president. Trump didn't stop at social media. He brought it to rallies. In public appearances, Trump started ranting about Judge Boasberg, calling him by name, telling crowds that the judge was part of a conspiracy against Trump, that judges like Boasberg were weaponizing the judiciary to undermine Trump's presidency, and then Trump escalated to calls for action. He said Judge Boasberg should be impeached, that Congress should remove him from the bench. And in some of his more extreme moments, Trump suggested Boasberg should be arrested, that judges who rule against the president are committing crimes and should face criminal prosecution. This isn't dog whistles or coded language. This is Trump explicitly calling for retaliation against a judge who ruled against him. The impact of Trump's attacks on judges and court staff is well documented. After Trump attacks someone publicly, that person receives death threats, gets harassed, has their family targeted. We've seen this pattern over and over. Trump attacks, his supporters mobilize. The target of Trump's attacks faces threats and intimidation, and that's exactly what happened with Judge Boasberg. According to reports, after Trump started attacking him, Boasberg and his family received threats, had to increase security. Court staff connected to the cases also faced harassment, all because Trump decided to make Boasberg a target. That's not just inappropriate, that's dangerous. That creates an environment where judges have to worry about their safety when ruling against the president, and that's exactly what intimidation is designed to do, make judges think twice before ruling against powerful people. The articles of impeachment filed against Trump focus on this pattern of behavior. The specific charges include abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of the separation of powers. The abuse of power charge argues that Trump is using his position as president to intimidate judges and undermine judicial independence, that he's attempting to coerce judges into ruling favorably by threatening them with removal or prosecution if they don't. That's a clear abuse of executive power. Presidents have enormous power and platform. When they use that power to attack and threaten judges, it's an abuse. The obstruction of justice charge relates to Trump's attempts to interfere with judicial proceedings by attacking judges handling his cases, by trying to get judges removed, by creating an atmosphere of intimidation. All of that obstructs the fair administration of justice. The violation of separation of powers charge is perhaps the most fundamental. The Constitution creates three co-equal branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. Each is supposed to check the others. None is supposed to dominate. The judiciary's role is to interpret and apply the law, including reviewing executive actions to ensure they comply with the Constitution and statutes. The judicial review power is fundamental. It's how courts check executive overreach. And for judicial review to work, judges have to be independent, have to be able to rule based on law without fear of retaliation from the executive branch. When a president attacks judges, calls for their removal, threatens them with prosecution, he's undermining that independence. He's trying to make the judiciary subordinate to the executive, and that violates the separation of powers. That's why impeachment articles include this charge. Yeah, because Trump's behavior threatens the constitutional structure itself. The congressional response has been swift but predictably partisan. Democrats are largely united in supporting the impeachment articles. They're arguing that Trump's attacks on Judge Boasberg represent a clear and present danger to judicial independence, that allowing this behavior to continue unchecked sets a terrible precedent. That impeachment is the appropriate constitutional response to a president who abuses power and threatens the separation of powers. Republicans are more divided. Some are defending Trump, arguing he has a right to criticize judges, that his attacks are protected by free speech, that Democrats are overreacting and weaponizing impeachment. But other Republicans are expressing concern, not necessarily supporting impeachment, but acknowledging that Trump's behavior is problematic, that presidents shouldn't call for judges to be arrested, that there are lines that shouldn't be crossed even by presidents of your own party. The interesting dynamic is that some Republicans have actually filed their own articles of impeachment, but against Judge Boasberg rather than against Trump. Representative Brandon Gill from Texas filed articles seeking to impeach Judge Boasberg for ruling against Trump. The argument is that Boasberg exceeded his authority, that his rulings were political rather than legal, that judges who consistently rule against the president should be removed. This is obviously backwards. Judges ruling against the president isn't grounds for impeachment. Judges are supposed to be independent, are supposed to rule based on law. The fact that those rulings go against the president doesn't mean the judge did anything wrong. But these Republican impeachment articles against Boasberg show how polarized this has become. Some Republicans are so loyal to Trump that they're willing to attack judicial independence to defend him. Chief Justice Roberts' statement is particularly significant because of how rare it is. Roberts has been Chief Justice since 2005, and in all that time, he's been extremely careful about staying out of political controversies. He doesn't comment on legislation, doesn't take sides in political debates, doesn't respond to criticism of the court, except in very limited circumstances. He sees his role as protecting the institutional integrity of the judiciary, and he does that in part by maintaining neutrality and not getting drawn into partisan fights. But Trump's attacks on Judge Boasberg were so extreme that Roberts apparently felt he had no choice but to respond, to defend judicial independence publicly, to make clear that Trump's behavior is unacceptable. Roberts' statement was carefully worded but forceful. He emphasized that federal judges take an oath to decide cases based on law and facts, not based on political considerations, that judicial independence is fundamental to the rule of law. That disagreement with a judicial decision does not justify impeaching the judge who issued it. And implicitly, though Roberts didn't name Trump directly, he was rejecting Trump's calls for Judge Boasberg's impeachment and arrest. Roberts was saying that judges have to be free to rule without fear of retaliation from presidents or other political actors, that attacking judges for their rulings undermines the entire system, that this behavior is dangerous and should stop. The fact that Roberts felt compelled to make this statement tells you how serious the situation is. Roberts wouldn't break his normal practice of silence unless he thought the threat to judicial independence was real and urgent, unless he thought Trump's attacks had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. And Roberts' statement has been amplified by other judges. Federal judges from across the country, appointed by presidents of both parties, have issued their own statements defending judicial independence and criticizing attempts to intimidate judges. Some judges have spoken about the threats they've received after ruling against Trump, about having to increase security for themselves and their families, about the chilling effect Trump's attacks have on the judiciary. Legal scholars are describing this as a constitutional crisis because it involves a fundamental clash between the branches of government. The executive branch, in the form of President Trump, is attacking the judicial branch for doing its constitutional job, is trying to intimidate judges into ruling favorably, is calling for judges to be removed or prosecuted for rulings the president doesn't like. And the question is whether the other branches and institutions can check this behavior, whether Congress will actually impeach and potentially remove a president who threatens judicial independence, whether judges will continue ruling based on law despite the threats and attacks, whether the system of checks and balances is strong enough to survive this assault. What makes this particularly dangerous is that it's not just about Trump, it's about precedent. If Trump can attack judges without consequences, future presidents will do the same. If calling for a judge's impeachment or arrest becomes normalized presidential behavior, judicial independence dies. Judges start ruling based on what they think the president wants rather than what the law requires, because they know if they rule against the president, they'll be attacked, threatened, potentially removed. That's how authoritarian systems work. courts become rubber stamps for executive power rather than independent checks on it. And once you lose judicial independence, you lose the rule of law, because there's no institution left to constrain executive power, no way to enforce legal limits on what presidents can do. Okay, so let's break this down into the key points, because this is complex and high stakes, and you need to understand what's really at issue here. Point number one, Trump's attacks on Judge Boasberg aren't just inappropriate or norm-breaking. They're a direct threat to judicial independence and the separation of powers. When a president attacks a judge for ruling against him, when he calls for that judge's removal or arrest, he's sending a message to all judges. The message is, rule in my favor or face consequences. That's intimidation. That's an attempt to coerce judicial decisions through threats rather than through legal arguments, and it's fundamentally incompatible with how our constitutional system is supposed to work. Judicial independence means judges decide cases based on law and facts, not based on political pressure or fear of retaliation. That independence is protected in multiple ways. Federal judges serve for life unless impeached for actual misconduct. They can't be fired by the president. Their salaries can't be reduced. All of these protections exist to ensure judges can make unpopular decisions without worrying about losing their jobs. But those formal protections don't work if presidents can create informal pressure through public attacks and threats. If judges know that ruling against the president will result in being called corrupt, in receiving death threats, in being targeted for impeachment or prosecution, they'll be influenced by that pressure. They'll be less likely to rule against the president even when the law requires it. And that's exactly what Trump is trying to achieve. He's trying to create an environment where judges are afraid to rule against him. Point number two, the impeachment articles filed against Trump are constitutionally appropriate and legally justified. Impeachment exists to check presidential abuses of power, to provide a remedy when a president violates the Constitution or threatens the functioning of our democratic system. And Trump's attacks on judges clearly qualify. He's using his power as president to intimidate a coordinate branch of government, to try to make the judiciary subordinate to the executive, to undermine the separation of powers that's fundamental to our constitutional structure. Those are textbook high crimes and misdemeanors, not in the criminal law sense, but in the constitutional sense of serious abuses of power that threaten the republic. The specific charges in the impeachment articles, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, violation of separation of powers, all flow directly from Trump's conduct. He abused his power by using the presidency's platform and influence to attack and threaten judges. He obstructed justice by trying to intimidate judges handling cases involving him. He violated separation of powers by attempting to coerce judicial decisions through threats, rather than respecting judicial independence. Each of these charges is serious. Each is supported by clear evidence. Trump's attacks on Judge Boasberg are public. They're documented in his social media posts, his rally speeches, his interviews. There's no question about what he said or did. The only question is whether Congress will hold him accountable. Point number three, Chief Justice Roberts' public statement is a huge deal and shows how serious the judicial branch considers this threat. Roberts doesn't speak out lightly. He's been Chief Justice for nearly 20 years and has maintained a careful neutrality throughout. He doesn't want the court seen as political, doesn't want to wade into partisan controversies. The fact that he broke that pattern to defend Judge Boasberg and judicial independence generally tells you everything about how concerning Trump's behavior is. Roberts sees it as a genuine threat, not just to Judge Boasberg personally, but to the entire judicial branch, to the principle that judges can rule based on law without fear of executive retaliation, and Roberts felt he had no choice but to speak out publicly to defend that principle. And Roberts isn't alone. Federal judges across the country have been speaking out. Some have given speeches about the importance of judicial independence. Some have written articles. Some have discussed the threats they face when they rule against Trump. There's a growing recognition within the judiciary that Trump's attacks represent an existential threat, that if this behavior is normalized, if future presidents follow Trump's example, the federal judiciary's independence will be seriously compromised. So judges are defending their branch, are making the case publicly that they need to be able to rule based on law without political interference. And they're hoping that Congress and the public will support that independence by checking Trump's behavior. So what actually happens next? Well, the impeachment process has several stages. First, the House Judiciary Committee will hold hearings on the articles. They'll hear testimony from constitutional scholars, from judges, from former Justice Department officials. all testifying about whether Trump's conduct rises to the level of impeachable offenses, Democrats will argue it clearly does. That attacking judges is an abuse of power that threatens the constitutional order. Republicans will argue it doesn't, that Trump's attacks, while perhaps inappropriate, don't constitute high crimes and misdemeanors, that he's just exercising his First Amendment rights to criticize judges, that Democrats are weaponizing impeachment for political purposes. The committee will eventually vote on whether to refer the articles to the full House. If the articles get through committee, which is likely given Democratic control, they'll go to the House floor for a vote. And this is where things get interesting because Democrats have the votes to impeach on their own. They don't need Republican support, but the political dynamics matter. If this is purely partisan, if no Republicans vote for impeachment, it looks like political warfare rather than constitutional accountability. Trump and his defenders will claim it's a witch hunt. We'll argue it's just Democrats trying to overturn the 2024 election results through impeachment because they can't beat Trump at the ballot box. But if some Republicans break ranks, if even a handful vote for impeachment, it changes the narrative. It suggests Trump's conduct really did cross a constitutional line, that it's not just partisan disagreement, but genuine concern about abuse of power. Assuming the House votes to impeach, the case then goes to the Senate for trial. And this is where things get really complicated because conviction in the Senate requires a 2/3 vote. That's 67 senators if everyone is present. And with the Senate currently divided, getting to 67 votes would require substantial Republican support, like 15 to 20 Republicans would have to vote to convict. Historically, that's been almost impossible. Trump was impeached twice in his first term and acquitted both times because Republicans stuck with him. But this situation is different in some ways because Trump is attacking judicial independence. And that's something that should concern everyone, including Republican senators, because they rely on independent courts too. They want judges to rule based on law when Republican policies are challenged. They don't want future Democratic presidents to be able to intimidate judges into ruling favorably. So there's at least a possibility that some Republican senators will see Trump's attacks on judges as crossing a line they can't ignore. But even if conviction is unlikely, the impeachment process itself matters. It creates a public record of Trump's conduct, forces a debate about presidential powers and limits, puts pressure on Republicans to either defend Trump's attacks on judges or condemn them, makes it harder for Trump to claim he did nothing wrong when Congress is formally charging him with abuse of power, and it sends a message to future presidents that attacking judges has consequences, that Congress takes its role in checking executive abuses seriously. Even if Trump isn't removed from office, the impeachment makes clear that his behavior is unacceptable. The political implications are significant and will play out over months. Trump will use the impeachment to rally his base, will claim he's being persecuted by Democrats who can't accept that he won the election, will argue the whole thing is political theater designed to distract from his agenda. And with his core supporters, that message will work. They already believe the system is rigged against Trump, already think Democrats and the establishment are out to get him. Impeachment just confirms that worldview. But for everyone else, for independents and moderate Republicans, Trump's attacks on judges are concerning. The idea that a president can call for a judge's arrest just for ruling against him feels authoritarian, feels like something that happens in dictatorships, not democracies. And the impeachment process will highlight that concern, will force people to think about whether they want a president who threatens judicial independence. The long-term implications for judicial independence are enormous. If Trump's attacks on judges work, if he succeeds in intimidating judges or getting them removed, it sets a precedent that destroys judicial independence. Future presidents will know they can attack judges without real consequences, can threaten them, can call for their impeachment or arrest, and judges will know that ruling against the president brings massive personal and professional risks. That changes how judges make decisions, makes them more cautious about ruling against executive power, more likely to defer to the president even when the law would support ruling against him. And that's the end of checks and balances. Because if courts can't check executive power, if judges are afraid to rule against the president, then the executive becomes essentially unlimited, can do whatever it wants, can ignore laws, can violate the Constitution, and there's no institutional check left to stop it. That's why legal experts are calling this a constitutional crisis, not because one president attacked one judge, but because this represents a systematic assault on the principles that make our constitutional system work. The independence of the judiciary, the separation of powers, the rule of law. All of these are under threat when presidents can intimidate judges without consequences. And whether our system can withstand that threat depends on how institutions respond, on whether Congress holds Trump accountable through impeachment, on whether judges continue ruling based on law despite the attacks and threats, on whether the public demands that judicial independence be protected. This is a test of our democratic institutions, of whether checks and balances still function, of whether anyone, even a president, can be held accountable when they abuse power. The final point is this. Trump's attacks on Judge Boasberg and the resulting impeachment articles represent a defining moment, a moment when we have to decide what kind of government we want. Do we want a system where courts can independently check executive power, where judges rule based on law without fear of presidential retaliation, where separation of powers still means something? Or do we want a system where presidents can intimidate judges into ruling favorably, where courts become subordinate to executive power, where judicial independence is just a nice idea that doesn't apply when the president decides to attack judges who rule against him? Those are the stakes. That's what this crisis is really about. And how it resolves, whether through impeachment and removal or through Trump being allowed to continue attacking judges without consequences, will shape American democracy for generations. Because once you lose judicial independence, once you normalize presidential attacks on judges, you can't easily get it back. The precedent is set, the damage is done, and future presidents will exploit that damage. Will attack judges, will intimidate courts, will gradually erode the independence that makes judicial review possible. That's the path we're on if Trump's behavior isn't checked. And that's why this impeachment matters so much. It's not just about Trump. It's about whether our constitutional system can survive attacks from within, from presidents who don't respect the limits on their power, who see judicial independence as an obstacle to be destroyed rather than a principle to be respected. The answer to that question will determine what American democracy looks like going forward.